I'm heading out. I've done everything I needed to. Don't interfere. I'm not ready to discuss it. And frankly, it's none of your business. I turned on my heel, ignoring the desperate calls from Lucas, my husband. At that moment, something inside me snapped. All the affection I once felt for him dissolved, and I knew this was just the beginning of the unraveling. It all started right before the holidays. It was our first Christmas since tying the knot, and I had been eagerly planning everything. My name is Claire, I'm 26, and I recently married a man the same age. We met at work, though we're in different departments. I'm the kind who likes to tackle tasks head-on, while Lucas is more laid-back, often taking his time with decisions. The contrast between us is noticeable to everyone, and many of our co-workers have mentioned how mismatched we seem. But despite our differences, we'd managed to make it work. Until recently. It was late December, and Lucas and I were chatting about the upcoming holidays. What about Christmas? Should we visit both of our families? I asked, smiling as I imagined the two of us visiting our parents, sharing dinner, and exchanging gifts. Lucas nodded, but his response was far from enthusiastic. His distant expression made me pause, but I shrugged it off. The holidays were always a busy time at work, and I figured stress was getting to both of us. I was swamped with deadlines, working overtime daily, and rarely seeing Lucas. Finally, on December 23rd, I finished work on time for once. Walking into our apartment, I noticed something strange, an unfamiliar pair of shoes at the door. Next to Lucas's usual sneakers was a pair that clearly belonged to a woman. I furrowed my brow and stepped into the living room. "Hey, I'm home. Who's here?" Lucas was sitting on the couch, and next to him was a woman I recognized, his sister, Alyssa. I had only met her a few times, but she always seemed intense. "Oh, hi, Claire. Late as usual, huh?" Alyssa's tone was sharp as she eyed me from across the room. "My work has been a bit crazy lately," I muttered, glancing at Lucas. He said nothing, his expression unreadable. Alyssa didn't let up. "Maybe you should reconsider working so much. After all, once you're married, you should focus on the household. Right, Lucas?" I froze. Quit my job? That wasn't part of the plan. Lucas and I had discussed this before getting married. He knew how important my career was to me. I turned to him, searching for support, but he only stared blankly at the floor. "You've always known how I feel about this, Claire," Lucas said quietly, finally speaking up. "I thought, after marriage, you'd consider things differently." I felt a chill down my spine. This wasn't the Lucas I knew. Alyssa, clearly satisfied with her brother's compliance, smirked and grabbed his arm. "He's coming to our parents' place for Christmas," she said with a victorious gleam in her eyes. "Alone?" I was stunned. "What about us? This is our first Christmas together." Lucas shrugged. "You never asked me if that's what I wanted." His words hit me like a truck. I stood there, frozen, as Alyssa led him toward the door. They left me standing in the living room, utterly alone, my heart sinking as the sound of the front door closing echoed through the apartment. The next few days were a blur. I was hurt, angry, and confused. How had things spiraled so quickly? I thought we were on the same page, but clearly I had been wrong. Just as I was about to lose hope, my phone rang. It was my dad. "Claire, why don't you come home for Christmas? You don't have to deal with this alone." Without a second thought, I packed my things. With my dad's help, we moved out everything I had brought into that apartment. Everything I had worked hard for. Nearly everything in that place had been purchased by me, and as I packed up, I realized just how one-sided our relationship had been. I had been giving, and Lucas had taken advantage of it. A few days later, my dad and I decided to confront Lucas and his family directly. On Christmas morning, we arrived at Alyssa's house unannounced. She answered the door with a scowl. "What do you want?" she spat. "We're here to finalize things," my dad said firmly, handing her the divorce papers. Alyssa was furious, but my dad remained calm, his loyalty demeanor showing through. After a heated exchange, Lucas finally emerged from the house. He looked lost, unsure of himself without his sister to speak for him. "There's no way we're getting divorced," Lucas shouted. I sighed. "Then we'll see you in court. Trust me, Lucas. This won't end well for you." The reality of the situation must have sunk in, because a few days later, I received the signed papers. It was over. Lucas and I were no longer tied to each other. It hurt, but at the same time, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I threw myself back into my work, surrounded by supportive colleagues who had seen firsthand how difficult things had been. Lucas never returned to the office. Word spread quickly, and everyone knew the truth. As for me, I'm doing better than ever, moving forward with my life and my career. Whatever Lucas is doing now, I don't know, and frankly, I don't care. I'm free, and that's all that matters. Weeks passed, and I settled into my new apartment near my parents' home. Life moved on quietly, but the echoes of my past still lingered in my mind. I spent more time with my family, feeling the warmth of their support. However, something inside me refused to let go of the hurt I had endured. There was a sense of unfinished business, a need for closure that still gnawed at me. One evening, as I was wrapping up work on a new project, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment before answering, expecting it to be work-related. Instead, a familiar voice cut through the silence. "Hey, it's me. I don't know if you'll answer, but I just need to talk." It was him, my ex-husband. My hand tightened around the phone, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Why was he calling? What could he possibly have to say now, after all this time? "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened," he continued, his voice quieter than I remembered. "And I realize now, I messed up. I should have stood up for you, for us. I should have been honest about how I felt." There was a pause, as if he was waiting for me to say something, but I remained silent, letting him speak. After all, this was the man who had let his sister walk all over our marriage. What could he possibly say that would change anything? "I know it's too late," he added, almost as if reading my mind. "But I want you to know I'm sorry. I shouldn't have let her get between us. I should have fought harder." Fought harder? I thought bitterly. He didn't fight at all. "I lost my job," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper now. "After everything, I just couldn't focus. And when you left, I realized how much I relied on you, how much I took for granted. I'm sorry, Ray." There it was, the apology I had once wanted to hear. But now, after all that had happened, it felt hollow. Too little, too late. He was only sorry because his life had fallen apart without me. But where was this regret when I needed it? Where was this realization when I stood in front of him, pleading for our marriage? "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said, his voice breaking. I wanted you to know that I've changed. I'm trying to be better." "Trying?" I finally said, my voice cold. "You're trying now, after everything's already over. I don't know if that's supposed to make me feel better, but it doesn't." "I know," he whispered. I'm sorry." I hung up the phone without another word. His apologies wouldn't fix the past, and I wasn't about to let his guilt drag me back into that toxic cycle. I had moved on. I had found my peace, and I wasn't going to let him take that away from me. As I sat in the silence of my apartment, I realized something important. For the first time, I didn't feel any anger. No resentment, just indifference. His words no longer had the power to hurt me. I had grown beyond that. Beyond him. The next day, I called my lawyer. There were still some final loose ends to tie up regarding the divorce settlement. I was ready to close this chapter of my life once and for all. No more lingering doubts. No more unanswered questions. By the time the papers were officially filed, I felt lighter. Free, in a way I hadn't been in years. Christmas had come and gone, but the new year brought with it a sense of renewal. My career continued to flourish, and I started traveling more for work. I was finding myself again, discovering new passions, and building a life that I controlled. one that wasn't dictated by someone else's expectations or needs. As time passed, I occasionally heard snippets of what had become of my ex-husband. He had moved back in with his parents, unable to hold down a job. His sister had taken over more aspects of his life, and he was struggling to find his footing. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I was free, finally living life on my own terms. And I knew that no matter what happened, I would never let anyone take that freedom from me again. As the months rolled by, life took on a new rhythm. The sun seemed to shine a little brighter, and my laughter was louder and more frequent. My days were filled with work that excited me, and I spent my evenings with friends, rediscovering the joy of spontaneity. No longer shackled by the weight of an unhappy marriage, I felt like I was finally living for myself. But every so often, the past would rear its head. Sometimes it was a brief mention of my ex-husband through old mutual friends, or the occasional sighting of his sister at social events. Each time, I felt nothing but a quiet satisfaction that I had escaped a life that no longer served me. I was thriving. It was during one of these chance encounters that the next chapter of my story began. I was attending a work event in the city, a networking gala where professionals gathered to exchange ideas and, in many cases, seek out new opportunities. The venue was a sleek rooftop bar, the skyline of the city twinkling in the distance as the soft hum of conversation filled the air. "Ray!" A voice called out from behind me, cutting through the noise. I turned, expecting to see a colleague or acquaintance, but instead, I was greeted by a familiar face, James. James was an old friend from my early days at the company, someone I hadn't seen in years. He had left for a job overseas, and we had lost touch. But here he was, standing before me, looking every bit as handsome and confident as I remembered. "James, I didn't know you were back in the city," I exclaimed, genuinely surprised. "Yeah, I've been back for a few months now. I'm working with a new startup here," he replied with a grin. "I heard you were killing it at your company. Congratulations." We spent the next few minutes catching up, talking about work, travel, and everything in between. It felt easy, natural. But there was something more in the air between us, an unspoken connection that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was the fact that I was different now, more confident, more sure of myself. Or maybe James had changed too. As the night wore on, we found ourselves drifting away from the crowd, eventually settling at a quiet corner table. The conversation shifted from work to more personal topics, and before I knew it, we were talking about our past relationships. "So, what happened to that guy you were married to?" James asked carefully, not wanting to pry but clearly curious. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much I wanted to share. But something about James made me feel safe, like I could be honest without judgment. "Well," I began, taking a sip of my drink. It ended. Not well, but it ended. He raised an eyebrow, waiting for me to continue. Long story short, he let his sister run our marriage into the ground, and when I finally had enough, I walked away. I said, trying to keep my tone light, though the memories still stung a little. James frowned slightly. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. It sounds rough." It was, I admitted, but I'm better now. Happier, even. I've learned a lot about myself since then. James smiled softly. "You seem like you've come out stronger. I always admired that about you, your resilience." His words caught me off guard, but they warmed me in a way I hadn't expected. For the rest of the evening, we continued talking, laughing, and reminiscing about old times. There was an undeniable spark between us, one that I hadn't felt in a long time. But I didn't rush it. After everything I had been through, I knew better than to dive headfirst into something new without thinking it through. Over the next few weeks, James and I kept in touch. We met for coffee, shared dinner a few times, and even went to a couple of work events together. It was easy, fun, and refreshing to spend time with someone who respected me and my ambitions. There was no pressure, no hidden agendas, just two people enjoying each other's company. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, James and I found ourselves sitting on a bench at a small park near my apartment. The city lights flickered in the distance, and the cool night air wrapped around us like a comforting blanket. "I've been meaning to tell you something," James said, his voice serious but gentle. "I really enjoy spending time with you, Ray, and I think I'd like to see where this goes." My heart skipped a beat. For so long, I had been guarded, afraid to open up again after the hurt my marriage had caused. But with James, it felt different. There was no weight, no baggage, just the possibility of something new. "I'd like that too," I replied softly, a smile tugging at my lips. We sat there in comfortable silence for a while, watching the world pass by. In that moment, I realized that life had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. Just when I thought my story had been written, a new chapter had begun, one filled with hope, laughter, and the promise of something real. And this time, I was writing it on my own terms. As the days passed, I felt myself opening up more to the idea of love again. Not the kind that left me feeling suffocated or diminished, but the kind that felt equal, supportive, and empowering. James became a part of my life, not as someone to lean on, but as someone to walk alongside. The past, with all its pain and confusion, was finally behind me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt excited about the future, whatever it may hold. After all, I had learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes, in order to find yourself, you have to lose what no longer serves you. And now that I had found myself again, I wasn't going to let anything or anyone stand in the way of my happiness.